Oh, I don't know. I mean, could have come off maybe a couple cemetery tombstones.
Picture this. New York City, 1986. The Bitter End nightclub in Greenwich Village. Cigarette smoke curls in the air. The walls are lined with decades of music history. It's the kind of place where legends are born, and grudges are buried, or so they say. That night, Bob Dylan was supposed to sit in for a surprise acoustic set. Just a few songs, nothing major, but moments before he takes the stage, a note is slipped into his hand. 3 words, a name. He reads it, frowns, steps back. Then without a word, he turns around, guitar still on his back, and walks out the back door into the cold Manhattan night. He never explains why, not to the club, not to the press, not even to the friend who invited him. But those who knew him best? They knew exactly what that name meant, and why it still haunted him. Now, decades later, Dylan isn't holding back. At 83, the man who spent a lifetime dodging interviews and avoiding drama is finally cracking open the vault. Not for revenge, not for applause, but for truth. And the list? It's not made up of rivals. These were collaborators, icons, even friends. Once, first on the list, a guitarist whose flattery turned to sabotage. The guitarist who tried to replace him, Eric Clapton. On the surface, Eric Clapton and Bob Dylan seemed like musical soulmates, 2 titans of guitar-driven revolution who rose from different corners of the scene but spoke the same musical language. They admired each other's songwriting, shared festival stages, even collaborated on impromptu live sets that fans still rave about decades later. Clapton once called Dylan the greatest poet in music, and Dylan, for his part, respected Clapton's blues mastery. But behind the scenes, there was tension. During the late 70s, at a time when Dylan was experimenting with gospel and spiritual themes, Clapton reportedly made a comment that stung. He allegedly told a mutual producer, perhaps after a few drinks, that Dylan was losing it, that his edge was gone, that the crown of poetic rock needed a new air, and Clapton, riding high from his solo success, hinted that maybe it should be him. He didn't say it arrogantly, but it didn't come off humbly either. Word got back to Dylan, and though he didn't make a public scene, insiders say the impact was immediate. A joint recording session that had been quietly scheduled, canceled, with no explanation. Dylan reportedly saw Clapton's gentlemanly demeanor as a mask, smooth on the outside, calculating underneath. And in Dylan's world, betrayal, especially from another songwriter, cut deeper than any critic's review. Next up, a 60s icon whose protest anthems clashed with Dylan's most personal reinvention, the folk queen who voiced his conscience, Joan Baez. They were once the royal couple of folk, harmonizing on stage, marching at civil rights rallies, spreading messages of peace and justice to crowds that saw them as the voice of a generation. Bob Dylan and Joan Baez weren't just musical partners. They were cultural icons, emotionally and politically entwined. Their duets felt like declarations. Their presence at protests made headlines. Together, they made folk music feel urgent, revolutionary, and deeply human. But Dylan changed. He electrified his sound, literally, plugging in at Newport in 1965 and trading protest anthems for surreal, personal poetry. It wasn't just a sonic shift. It was a spiritual one. And Baez? She didn't just disapprove. She felt abandoned. She had built her platform on activism, and Dylan's pivot felt to her like a retreat from the cause they once shared. Joan tried to pull him back, urged him to return to political roots, publicly criticized his shift, even told interviewers that he had lost his purpose, framing his evolution as a form of artistic selfishness. To Dylan, it wasn't a debate about music, it was betrayal, from someone who had known his insecurities, his fears, his drive, and used them to attack his choices. It cut deep. He never slammed her in the press, never fired back in song, but he did something just as pointed. For over 4 decades, he refused to collaborate with her. When pressed in private about the rift, He once muttered under his breath, "She sang for the people. I was singing for myself." And now we arrive at the most unexpected feud of all, with a frontman Dylan once helped make famous. The punk poet who mocked him in public. Lou Reed. Bob Dylan appreciated risk-takers. He admired those who broke the mold, who pushed boundaries, who reinvented sound itself. Innovators didn't threaten him. They inspired him. But there was one thing he couldn't abide: mockery, especially when it came from artists who, in his eyes, had built their careers on roads he had paved. Lou Reed, frontman of the Velvet Underground, was one of those artists, and in a 1974 interview, Reed let loose. He said Dylan never really meant anything to him, claimed Dylan's lyrics were all smoke and mirrors, dismissed him as a poet of pretense, someone who pioneered not meaning but self-importance. It hit a nerve. Dylan didn't fire back. No retaliatory verse, no public rebuttal, just silence, but not the kind that gets forgotten. Lou Reed's name vanished from Dylan's universe. No mentions in liner notes, no allusions in interviews, not even a name check in the countless speeches and memoirs where Dylan paid tribute to his peers. Reed was erased. Then came the telling moment. In the early 90s, a Rolling Stone journalist casually brought up Lou Reed during an interview. Dylan looked up from his cigarette, raised an eyebrow, and simply asked, "Who?" Then he smiled. It wasn't a joke. It was a dismissal so complete it rang louder than any diss track ever could. But the next name on the list? That feud didn't play out in silence. It turned downright theatrical. The showman who mocked his voice. Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa was never one to mince words. He thrived on confrontation, challenged convention, and wielded sarcasm like a scalpel. And when it came to Bob Dylan, he didn't hold back. In multiple interviews across the 70s and 80s, Zappa dismissed Dylan's voice as a tragic accident, mocked his lyrics as pseudo-intellectual ramblings, and ridiculed his fanbase as brainwashed sheep who think they're enlightened. Most artists wrote Zappa off as a provocateur, brilliant but deliberately inflammatory. They knew better than to bite back. But Dylan wasn't most artists. Years later, at a party in Laurel Canyon, a casual gathering of musicians, poets, and producers, a mutual friend spotted them both in attendance and saw an opportunity for peace. He tried to bring them together for a handshake, but Dylan stood frozen. He refused to reach out. The air grew tense. Zappa, never one to let awkwardness hang in silence, smirked, raised his drink, and quipped, "I hear silence is your best verse." Dylan didn't respond. He just turned, walked out the door, and left the party 10 minutes later. To outsiders, it may have seemed like overreaction. But for Bob, it was never about artistic criticism. He could take that. It was about dignity. And to him, Zappa's jokes weren't clever. They were cutting, cruel, and deeply disrespectful. Next on the list, a friend-turned-foe who played with fire and then watched Dylan burn. The poet who stole his darkness, Leonard Cohen. This one's different. Dylan admired Leonard Cohen deeply, publicly, profoundly. He once called him the highest level of songwriting, a rare compliment from someone famously sparing with praise. The respect was real, but behind the reverence lay something more complex: rivalry and quiet resentment. Cohen's rise in the late 60s happened just as Dylan was withdrawing from the spotlight after his motorcycle accident. As Cohen's poetic, monk-like presence captivated the world, Dylan's absence grew louder. Some insiders say Dylan felt eclipsed, replaced even. Others whisper that Cohen's refined, brooding mystique made Dylan's wild energy seem reckless, outdated, even juvenile in comparison. But the real wound came from words. In an interview during the early 70s, Cohen reportedly remarked that Dylan's early songs were juvenile compared to mature poets. It wasn't intended as a jab. Cohen was musing on growth, on art, on evolution. But Dylan? He took it as a betrayal wrapped in academia. He didn't fire back in a song, didn't air it out in interviews, but he never forgot it. Years later, when Cohen passed, fans expected a heartfelt tribute from Dylan, something worthy of their intertwined legacies. Instead, they got 3 short lines. No emotional flourishes, no deep reflection, just a hollow acknowledgement. And for Bob Dylan, that said everything. But nothing stung quite like what came next. The legend who sold him out. Michael Bloomfield. Michael Bloomfield was Dylan's secret weapon on Highway 61 Revisited. His searing electric guitar work, sharp, spontaneous, and unapologetically raw, helped Dylan not just evolve, but explode into a new era. That album marked a turning point in music history, and Bloomfield was at the center of it. To Dylan, their collaboration wasn't just successful, it was sacred. But after that legendary project, Bloomfield slipped away. He turned down offers to tour. He ducked out of sessions. Some blamed his growing drug habit. Others said he was overwhelmed by the pressure. But for Dylan, it felt personal. He had trusted Bloomfield, depended on him in a moment of transformation, and then watched him vanish without a word. Years later, the real break came not from silence, but from speech. Bloomfield gave interviews where he downplayed Dylan's role and implied that he had saved Dylan's career by making him rock. He suggested he was the true architect of folk rock, that he gave Dylan the edge he desperately needed. Dylan was livid, not just hurt, but betrayed. In Bob's mind, their work had been a partnership, a mutual spark. But Bloomfield had rewritten history and claimed the flame for himself. And from that moment on, Dylan never spoke of him the same way, never praised him again, never called him back. And finally, the feud that goes deeper than music, all the way back to the Beatles. The Beatle who dismissed his genius, Paul McCartney. They were friendly, shared joints, shared admiration, even shared stages once or twice. But deep down, Dylan and Paul McCartney were never truly close. There was respect, but not resonance. Dylan liked John Lennon's sharp wit, his bite, his darkness. He saw in Lennon a kindred rebel spirit. But Paul? Dylan viewed him differently. Too polished, too pop, too eager to please. He appreciated McCartney's talent. How could he not? But there was a feeling that Paul was playing it safe, crafting melodies while Dylan was chasing meaning. The final straw came in 1987. In a seemingly offhand comment to a magazine, McCartney quipped that Dylan wasn't writing songs people could remember anymore. It was framed as casual critique, but to Dylan it hit like a backhanded slap, a dismissal of his later, more complex work. Songs filled with shadows, not sing-alongs. Dylan didn't retaliate publicly. He didn't pen a diss track or rant in interviews, but actions spoke louder. He abruptly pulled out of a proposed joint tour, citing vague reasons. It wasn't the right time. Insiders, however, knew the truth. In private, Dylan was more direct. "Paul writes love letters," he reportedly said. "I write scars." The tension never fully healed. They remained civil in public, but distant. And to this day, one thing remains clear. Dylan respected McCartney's fame, but not his fire. What this list really means, these names. They weren't just random enemies pulled from the shadows. They were once comrades in melody, brothers in verses, allies in rebellion, and in some cases, haunting reflections of Dylan himself. Maybe that's what made the wounds run so deep, because with every voice he turned away from, there was a ghost of his own past looking back. The youthful idealist, the wounded poet, the firebrand searching for meaning. These weren't just feuds, they were fractures of identity, reminders of who he was, who he feared becoming, and who he could never be again. And now, at 83, Bob Dylan isn't out for revenge. He's not rewriting history to settle scores. He's just telling the truth, finally, quietly, precisely, with that same haunting clarity he's always had. So tell us, who surprised you most on this list? And which of these broken bonds do you think still lingers in Bob's heart, unsaid but unresolved? Drop your thoughts in the comments, And don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories behind the music legends.